1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, by Charles C. Mann. Picture this. A man stumbles back home after years of unspeakable horror. He's been kidnapped, dragged across an ocean, enslaved in a foreign land, and somehow managed to escape and cross the Atlantic not once but twice. His name is Tisquantum. But here's the strange part. When he finally returns to his homeland and meets the pale-faced strangers who've just landed on his shores, he introduces himself with a name that roughly translates to the Wrath of God. Why on earth would anyone choose a name like that? And what does his story, the real story buried beneath our sanitized grade school version, reveal about the world he came from? We're about to dive into a book that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Americas before Columbus showed up. The book is called 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, and author Charles C. Mann has spent years assembling a picture of the past that's so radically different, so much grander and more intricate than the standard narrative, that it'll completely transform how you think about history and even the ground beneath your feet. Here's the story we've all been fed. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered a new world. This world was supposedly a vast, untouched wilderness, practically empty except for scattered bands of primitive nomads living in some kind of timeless, unchanging bubble. But this book drops a bombshell. That entire story is basically fiction. By the time we're done today, you'll see that the Americas in 1491 weren't a new world at all. They were actually an incredibly ancient one, more densely populated than Europe, shaped by human hands for thousands upon thousands of years. We're talking sprawling cities, jaw-dropping engineering marvels, and intellectual achievements that could go toe-to-toe with ancient Greece and Rome. This isn't the story of an empty land patiently waiting for civilization to arrive. It's the story of a thriving, bustling, astonishingly diverse world that was tragically destroyed and is only now being pieced back together. Ready to have your understanding of history completely flipped on its head? Let's dive in. To grasp what the world looked like before 1492, we first need to understand the massive misconception that's been clouding our vision for 5 centuries. Charles Mann calls it Holmberg's mistake. It's named after an anthropologist, Alan Holmberg, who spent time in the 1940s living with a group in Bolivia called the Siriono. What he observed seemed to confirm every stereotype about primitive societies you could imagine. The Siriono, according to his notes, lived in perpetual hunger. They had no clothing, no domestic animals, no art to speak of, and barely any religious practices. They couldn't even count beyond 3. Holmberg painted them as living fossils, people somehow frozen in the Stone Age, drifting through thousands of years without evolving, their history completely flat and featureless until Europeans arrived. He described them as the quintessence of man in the raw state of nature, and for decades everyone believed him. Holmberg's vision became the lens through which we viewed all Native Americans. Except Holmberg got it spectacularly wrong. What he completely missed was that the Siriono weren't ancient relics at all. They were traumatized survivors of a recent catastrophe. Just 1 generation before his arrival, devastating waves of smallpox and influenza had ripped through their society, wiping out more than 95% of their population. The small wandering bands he encountered weren't timeless primitives. They were refugees desperately fleeing abusive cattle ranchers who were stealing their land with help from the Bolivian military. It's like stumbling upon concentration camp survivors and concluding that their entire culture had always been defined by starvation and bare feet. He completely missed the story. He missed the history. And that's Holmberg's mistake in a nutshell, assuming that Native Americans were people without history, eternally frozen in some unchanging state. This mistake has infected our textbooks, our movies, and even our environmental movements. It gave us two equally broken stereotypes: the savage barbarian blocking the path of progress, and the noble savage, some gentle child of nature living in perfect harmony with the wilderness. Whether painted positively or negatively, both images strip indigenous peoples of their humanity. They turn them into passive background characters, either waiting to be conquered or waiting to teach us some spiritual lesson. It denies them the very thing that defines all human societies: the ability to change, innovate, create brilliance, and yes, make mistakes too. The truth, as Mann reveals, is infinitely more fascinating and complex. Let's tackle the most basic question: how many people actually lived in the Americas in 1491? The number we usually learned in school was laughably small, maybe 1 million people north of Mexico, perhaps 10 million in the entire hemisphere. But in the 1960s, a young anthropologist named Henry Dobbins started digging through dusty archives in Peru and Mexico, and what he discovered was absolutely staggering. He wasn't even looking for population figures initially. He was just studying old birth and death records. But he kept finding the same horrifying pattern. In ledger after ledger, the burial numbers massively outnumbered the baptisms. Entire communities were simply vanishing. The culprit? Disease. Dobbins had an epiphany that historians had somehow overlooked. The great disease waves, smallpox, measles, influenza, didn't just arrive with European colonists. They often arrived before them. These invisible killers traveled faster than the Europeans themselves, spreading from one native community to the next, along ancient trade networks. The first Europeans exploring many parts of the Americas were basically walking through a graveyard. They weren't seeing a pristine wilderness at all. They were seeing a recently devastated landscape. Dobbins calculated that in the first 130 years of contact, Native American populations plummeted by as much as 95%. Let that sink in for a moment. That's a death rate almost beyond comprehension. For every 20 people alive in 1491, only one remained by the mid-1600s. If this is accurate, then all our old population estimates, based on what those first colonists observed, are catastrophically off base. They weren't counting the original population at all. They were counting the handful of survivors. Dobbins proposed a straightforward but shocking calculation. Take the population at its lowest point and multiply by 20 to estimate the pre-contact population. The results were mind-blowing. He argued that the Americas in 1491 held somewhere between 90 and 112 million people. More people lived in the Americas than in Europe. Central Mexico alone was more densely populated than China or India. The Inca Empire was literally the largest empire on the entire planet. The Americas weren't an empty land at all. They were among the busiest, most densely populated, and most culturally diverse places on Earth. This demographic collapse represents the single greatest catastrophe in human history. It killed roughly 1 out of every 5 people on the entire planet. And it explains why 2 vast continents, once teeming with humanity, could appear so strangely empty to the waves of Europeans who followed. This brings us to one of America's most beloved origin stories, the Pilgrims and their friendly Indian, Squanto. The childhood version is heartwarming and simple. The Pilgrims, struggling through a brutal first winter, were saved by a kind native named Squanto, who taught them to plant corn. It's a lovely tale of cross-cultural cooperation, but it's yet another example of Holmberg's mistake. It strips away the man's motivations, his personal history, and the tragic context of his entire life. The man the pilgrims called Squanto was actually named Tisquantum. When he encountered the pilgrims, he'd just returned to his home, a Wampanoag village called Patuxet, after being kidnapped by English sailors 7 years earlier. He'd been dragged to Spain and sold into slavery, smuggled to London, finally secured passage back to North America, only to be kidnapped again before ultimately making his way home. But when he finally arrived, Patuxet was gone. It was a ghost town, littered with the skulls and bones of everyone he'd ever known and loved. A European disease, probably carried by traders, had swept through the coast between 1616 and 1619, killing up to 90% of the population. The Pilgrims literally built their Plymouth settlement on top of his abandoned village. Tisquantum wasn't some simple, friendly Indian. He was a man without a people, an apocalypse survivor trapped between two worlds. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, basically held him captive because he didn't trust him after all that time with the English. When Massasoit decided to form an alliance with the Pilgrims, it was born from desperation. His people had been so devastated by disease that he feared their rivals, the Narragansett, would soon conquer them. The English, with their bizarre metal weapons, seemed like a potentially useful, if dangerous, ally. Tisquantum became the translator. But he was also playing his own game. He tried to leverage his position with the Pilgrims to carve out a new power base for himself, to become a leader in his own right. He played the English and the Indians against each other, telling each side that the other was secretly planning betrayal. Eventually, his scheme unraveled. Massasoit demanded his execution, and the Pilgrims only refused because he was too valuable to them. He died just a year later, a man without a home, a tragic figure crushed in the gears of history. The story of the Pilgrims, survival isn't really about hardy pioneers taming the wilderness. It's about a small, desperate group of immigrants who landed in a depopulated, politically fractured landscape and survived only because of calculated political decisions made by a native leader who was himself trying to survive an even greater catastrophe. This same tragic pattern played out on a vastly larger scale in Peru with the fall of the Inca Empire. In 1491, the Inca ruled the greatest empire on earth. It was larger than Ming China, larger than any European state. Its domain stretched thousands of miles along the Andes, a testament to astonishing engineering and administrative genius. They built a 25,000-mile road system, constructed cities from stone without using mortar, and managed a complex non-market economy that essentially eradicated hunger across their vast realm. So how on earth did a force of just 168 Spaniards, led by Francisco Pizarro, bring it all crashing down? The standard answer is guns and steel, but Mann argues this explanation is way too simplistic. The Inca army was enormous and highly disciplined. Their quilted cloth armor was so effective that Spanish soldiers often ditched their own steel breastplates in favor of it. And the Inca quickly learned to counter Spanish cavalry by using bolas to tangle the horses' legs. The real story once again comes down to disease and internal division. Around 1525, years before Pizarro even set foot on the mainland, a smallpox epidemic tore through the empire. It had traveled down from Mexico, a silent, invisible invader. The disease killed the Inca emperor, Huayna along with his designated heir. This sudden power vacuum plunged the empire into a brutal civil war between two of his remaining sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa. When Pizarro showed up in 1532, he didn't walk into a stable, unified empire. He stepped into the smoking aftermath of a devastating war that had been triggered by an even more devastating plague. Atahualpa had just won the Civil War, but the empire was deeply scarred and politically fractured. Even then, Pizarro's victory at Cajamarca, where he captured Atahualpa, was equal parts treachery and incredible luck. The Inca emperor, curious about these strange visitors, agreed to meet them in the town square. He arrived on a golden litter, surrounded by thousands of lightly armed attendants, more parade than battle formation. Pizarro hid his men, horses, and cannons in the buildings surrounding the square. At his signal, they charged into the unarmed crowd. The chaos was absolute. The Spanish slaughtered thousands without suffering a single casualty, and took the emperor hostage. Even after capturing Atahualpa, the Spanish were still a tiny force in a massive empire. They only succeeded because they brilliantly exploited the political divisions left by the Civil War. They allied with factions loyal to the defeated Huáscar, who saw the Spanish as a tool to regain power. The Inca, in other words, weren't defeated by Europeans alone. They were brought down by a combination of a deadly virus and their own internal conflicts, which the Spanish were savvy enough to exploit. This pattern repeated itself across the hemisphere. Europeans didn't conquer a wilderness. They walked into a world shattered by disease, where ancient political structures and social systems were collapsing. They managed to play different groups against each other, not because they were inherently superior, but because they arrived at a moment of profound crisis. So the Americas weren't empty, and their conquest wasn't simply about technological superiority, but how long had these societies actually been there? The old story told us that the first Americans were the Clovis people, big game hunters who crossed from Siberia via the Bering Strait around 13,000 years ago pursuing mammoths. They supposedly spread rapidly through a land bridge and an ice-free corridor in Canada, and within just a few centuries they'd populated both continents. For decades this Clovis first model was absolute dogma. Any archaeologist claiming to find evidence of people before Clovis was basically committing professional suicide. They got hounded by what people called the Clovis police, a powerful group of academics who shut down any dissenting views. Then came a discovery at a boggy riverbank in southern Chile, a place called Monteverde. In the 1970s, an archaeologist named Tom Dillehay started excavating the site. What he found was extraordinary. The remains of a small settlement, wooden tent stakes, fragments of animal hide, even a child's footprint, preserved in the peat. The carbon dating was crystal clear. Monteverde was occupied at least 12,800 years ago. This was explosive. Monteverde is 10,000 miles south of the Bering Strait. For people to reach the southern tip of South America by 12,800 years ago, they would have had to cross from Siberia much earlier. It completely demolished the Clovis timeline. The Clovis police fought back hard, attacking Dillehay's methods for years, but eventually, in 1997, a group of the most prominent and skeptical archaeologists visited the site. After examining the evidence firsthand, they declared Monteverde legitimate. The game had fundamentally changed. Today, the Clovis first model is essentially dead. New genetic evidence suggests the first Americans may have arrived as far back as 20,000, 30,000, or possibly even 40,000 years ago. And they might not have come on foot at all. A growing number of researchers believe the first peoples were mariners, who traveled down the Pacific coast in small boats, island hopping from one coastal refuge to the next. What this means is that the story of the Americas is thousands of years older than we previously thought. the Western Hemisphere isn't a new world at all. If the dates for Monteverde hold up, people were living in Chile while most of Europe was still buried under ice, completely empty of human beings. So we've got a land that was ancient and populous. But what did these people actually do to the land? The flip side of Holmberg's mistake is the pristine myth, the belief that the Americas in 1491 were an untouched wilderness. This turns out to be equally wrong. Native Americans weren't passive inhabitants of the land, they were its architects. One of their most powerful tools was fire. From coast to coast, Native Americans systematically burned the landscape. They set fire to forest undergrowth to clear it out, creating open, park-like woods perfect for hunting. The first European colonists in Ohio described forests where you could drive carriages between the trees. In Virginia, John Smith claimed you could ride a horse at full gallop through the woods. This wasn't just about making hunting easier. The burning encouraged berry bushes, nut trees, and grasses that attracted game animals like deer and elk. They were essentially practicing a form of husbandry without fences. They weren't just hunting animals, they were actively creating the habitats that allowed those animals to thrive. The Great Prairies of the Midwest, celebrated as America's wild heartland, weren't entirely natural. They were created and maintained by millennia of deliberate Indian burning. When Lewis and Clark headed west, they weren't exploring pristine wilderness. They were traveling through a vast, continent-sized pasture managed by Native Americans. But perhaps the most dramatic example of landscape engineering comes from the Amazon. For a long time, ecologists believed the Amazon was a counterfeit paradise. Its lush greenery, they argued, masked brutally poor soils, where large-scale settled societies were impossible. The only viable lifestyle was slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing a small plot, farming it until the soil was exhausted, then moving on. This view, championed by Smithsonian archaeologist Betty Meggers, became environmental gospel. It meant that the accounts of early explorers like Gaspar de Carvajal, who described seeing riverbanks lined with cities and large towns for hundreds of miles, must have been exaggerations or outright lies. But in recent years, a new generation of researchers has discovered something incredible. Scattered throughout the Amazon are vast patches of rich, fertile black earth. It's called Terra Preta do Indio, Indian dark earth. This soil isn't natural, it's a human creation. It appears that ancient Amazonians created this supersoil by mixing charcoal, pottery shards, and organic waste into the ground. The charcoal acts like a magnetic sponge, grabbing onto nutrients and microorganisms that would otherwise wash away in tropical rains. Terra Preta is so ridiculously fertile that some patches have been continuously farmed for hundreds of years without needing fertilizer. Some researchers believe as much as 10% of the Amazon basin, an area the size of France, might be covered in this human-made soil. The people living here weren't just practicing slash and burn. They were practicing slash and char. Instead of burning vegetation to ash, they burned it slowly, without oxygen, to create charcoal, which they then mixed into the soil. They weren't just adapting to the forest. They were literally building it. They also transformed the forest by deliberately planting it. Over half of the 138 domesticated plant species in the Amazon are trees. When you walk through the Amazon today and pick fruit from a tree, there's a solid chance you're walking through an ancient orchard planted by people centuries ago. One researcher, William Bailey, estimates that at least an eighth of the non-flooded Amazon forest is anthropogenic, created by humans. Some of his colleagues think that's conservative. Some believe the entire Amazon is essentially a cultural artifact. What we think of as wilderness is often just an abandoned garden. This leads to a startling conclusion. The thundering herds of bison, the massive flocks of passenger pigeons that darkened the skies, the thick, impenetrable forests that confronted the first colonists. These weren't features of some timeless, pristine wilderness. They were signs of an ecosystem in collapse. When European diseases wiped out the Indians, they removed the keystone species that had been managing the continent for thousands of years. With the managers gone, the landscape went absolutely wild. Bison and passenger pigeon populations, no longer constrained by Indian hunting and land management, exploded into unsustainable numbers. Forests, no longer cleared by Indian fire, grew thick and tangled. The wilderness that enchanted writers like Thoreau wasn't a remnant of the world before humanity. It was a world created by humanity's sudden absence. It was the byproduct of a demographic catastrophe. The first Europeans didn't destroy a pristine wilderness. In a strange and tragic way, they actually created it. So where does all this leave us? For centuries, we've told ourselves a story of discovery, of a new world, of brave journeys into empty wilderness. But the real story is one of encounter. An encounter between two old worlds, two sets of ancient civilizations whose collision literally reshaped the entire planet. The Americas in 1491 weren't paradise. They were home to dynamic, complex societies facing challenges of politics, warfare, and environmental management, just like societies everywhere else. They had triumphs, and they had spectacular failures. The Maya civilization, for instance, didn't collapse simply because of drought. It fell because a century of brutal warfare between the city-states of Mutal and Khan had left their societies too brittle and their landscapes too stressed to withstand climatic shock. Their downfall was as much a political failure as an ecological one. The great city of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, likely collapsed because its leaders, in their quest for grandeur, deforested the surrounding hills, leading to catastrophic floods that undermined their authority. These aren't simple morality tales. They're complex human histories. Perhaps the greatest legacy of these societies isn't in their ruins or their crops, but in their ideas. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, created the Great Law of Peace, essentially a constitution for their five-nation confederacy, based on principles of consensus, limited government, and personal liberty. Women held significant power, choosing male leaders and wielding veto power over their decisions. When colonists like Benjamin Franklin encountered the Haudenosaunee, they were struck by their absolute notions of liberty. Here were societies where every person was considered master of their own life, where rigid social classes and deference to authority were practically non-existent. This living example of freedom had a profound, though often unacknowledged, influence on colonists, who were beginning to imagine a new kind of society, one free from European kings and aristocrats. The democratic, informal, brash spirit we think of as uniquely American has some of its deepest roots in the cultures of the very people whose world was destroyed to make way for it. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? What's the real lesson of Charles Mann's 1491? For me, it's a profound lesson in humility. It reminds us that the story we tell about the past is never the complete story. For 500 years, the history of the Americas has been written as if the continent were essentially a blank slate before 1492. This book fills in that massive silence, and in doing so, it doesn't just add a new chapter to world history, it forces us to rethink the entire narrative. The achievements of these societies are genuinely staggering. They engineered a completely new species, maize, that now feeds the entire world. They built cities rivaling those of Egypt and Mesopotamia in scale. They developed writing systems and mathematics, including the concept of zero, completely independently. And they managed their landscapes with a sophistication we're only beginning to appreciate. To realize that all of this was lost, and lost so completely that we're only now rediscovering it, represents a tragedy of almost unimaginable scale. It's a loss not just for the Americas, but for all humanity. Think about the ideas, the philosophies, the stories, the radically different ways of being human that simply vanished. It's as if an enormous library, filled with books from another world, was burned to the ground before anyone had a chance to read them. But the lesson here isn't just about loss. It's also about resilience and possibility. This new understanding of pre-Columbian history shows us that the Amazon rainforest, which we see as fragile wilderness, can actually be a managed, productive landscape. It demonstrates that human beings aren't just destroyers of nature, we can also be its creators. The terra preta soils of the Amazon are a gift from the past, evidence of an ecological intelligence we desperately need to learn from. So what can you, a curious and ambitious person, take from all this? First, I think it's the critical importance of questioning the stories you've been told. History isn't a collection of facts carved in stone. It's a narrative, and narratives are always shaped by whoever's telling them. Be skeptical of any story that seems overly simple, that reduces entire continents and peoples to one-dimensional caricatures. Look for complexity, contradictions, and the voices that have been silenced. Second, it's a powerful reminder that there's more than one way to be human, more than one way to build a society. The cultures of the Americas offer us this vast repository of different approaches to politics, environment, and community. The Haudenosaunee concept of liberty, the Inca system of collective labor, the Mesoamerican milpa, these aren't just historical curiosities. They're ideas, and ideas have real power. Finally, this book challenges us to see the world not as a collection of separate, isolated places, but as a single, interconnected story. The Columbian Exchange, as Alfred Crosby termed it, didn't just change the Americas and Europe. It created the modern world. The potatoes that fueled Europe's population explosion, the maize that transformed Africa, the silver that financed Asia's trade networks, all of these flow from the legacy of 1491. We're all living in the world that emerged from that collision. That was our journey through 1491 by Charles C. Mann. We've explored the grand sweep of a lost world today. But let me be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. It shows you the major landmarks and routes, but it can never replace actually walking the terrain yourself. The real magic happens when you dive into the book. When some particular story or quiet detail connects with you in an unexpected way, this summary is your guide to help you decide if this book is a journey worth taking. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, grab yourself a copy. Reading it isn't just about absorbing facts. It's an experience that will fundamentally shift how you see the history of our world. And if you found this journey valuable, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. There's this whole library of wisdom out there, and I genuinely believe that by exploring it together, we can keep growing. Thanks so much for listening.